Picture this. It is a Tuesday morning in Berlin, May 1923. You wake up, reach into your coat pocket and pull out a thick stack of banknotes, your wages from yesterday. You are not rich, you are not even comfortable, but you have money, and money is supposed to mean something. You walk into a bakery. The smell of fresh bread fills the air. You ask for a loaf. The baker names his price, 20,000 marks. You blink. Last month, that same loaf cost 250 marks. You pay. You have no choice. You sit down at a cafe next door, order a coffee to settle your nerves. The menu says 5,000 marks. You sip it slowly, thinking about your savings, about your children's future, about the war bonds you bought to support your country, bonds the government promised would hold their value. By the time you raise your hand for the bill, the waiter scratches out the price on your table card. It now reads 8,000 marks. The coffee got more expensive while you were drinking it. Here's the thing. This is not the famous horror story you've heard about. This is not the image of people pushing wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a single newspaper. That comes later. What you are witnessing right now in May of 1923 is only the beginning. The opening act of a catastrophe so complete, so methodically engineered, that it would wipe out an entire social class, shatter the faith of a nation, and quietly lay the groundwork for one of the darkest chapters in human history. This is the story of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, and how it was not merely incompetent, not simply unlucky, but was actively, deliberately, and patriotically used as a weapon to destroy the German currency from the inside out. This is the story of a brilliant old banker who confused loyalty to the state with loyalty to the people, and how that fatal mistake costs millions of ordinary Germans everything they had ever saved, ever earned, ever trusted. And this is a story that matters right now. Because the mechanics of what happened in Weimar Germany, the money printing, the loss of purchasing power, the collapse of the middle class, the political chaos that fills the vacuum, these are not ancient artifacts. They are a playbook. And powerful people would prefer you never learned to read it. So stay with me, because what I'm about to show you is not just history. It's a warning. Let's go back to where it all began, not in 1923, but years earlier, in the wreckage of a lost war. To understand what destroyed the Reichsbank, you first need to understand what destroyed Germany's faith in itself. In November 1918, the war ended. Germany lost, and what followed was not a peace treaty, it was a punishment document. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, handed Germany a reparations bill of 132 billion gold marks. Let that number sit for a moment. 132 billion gold marks. A figure so astronomically large that independent economists at the time quietly agreed it was never designed to be paid. It was designed to suffocate. Germany had no gold. Its reserves had been drained by 4 years of brutal industrial warfare. Its most productive regions, the coalfields of Alsace-Lorraine, the factories of Silesia, had been stripped away by the treaty itself. The country had been asked to run a marathon, then had its legs cut off at the starting line. So, how do you pay a debt in gold when you have no gold? The Weimar government tried the only thing left. Export goods, earn foreign currency, convert it. But with its industrial heartland gutted, Germany couldn't generate nearly enough. The government fell back on the one tool it still controlled, the printing press. And this is where we meet the man at the center of this catastrophe, Rudolf Havenstein, president of the Reichsbank. Havenstein was not an idiot. He was a product of the old imperial Germany. Brilliant, disciplined, deeply educated in classical banking. He had one guiding principle: his duty was not to protect the value of the currency. His duty was to serve the German state. Whatever the state needed, the Reichsbank would provide. The problem was that the state had been funding itself with borrowed money since 1914 throughout the entire war. Germany had not raised taxes to pay its soldiers. It had printed marks and sold war bonds to its own citizens. When the war was lost, those bonds became worthless. But the marks were still in circulation, already inflating, already rotting from within. The Reichsbank, by law, was legally bound to accept any treasury bill the government handed it and convert it immediately into cash. It was an automatic loan machine, an institutionalized money printer. The government needed money. The government handed Havenstein a piece of paper. Havenstein handed the government a stack of freshly printed marks. Over and over and over. And then came the event that turned a slow-burning crisis into an inferno. January 11th, 1923. 100,000 French and Belgian soldiers crossed into western Germany and occupied the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr was not just a region. It was Germany's industrial soul. Coal, steel, iron, the engine that powered the entire national economy. France's reasoning was brutal in its simplicity. If Germany won't pay its reparations, we'll take the value ourselves. We'll seize the mines, the factories, the railroads. We'll extract payment directly. Germany's military had been dissolved by the treaty. It could not fight back with guns. So Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno made a decision that was politically brilliant and economically suicidal. He called for passive resistance. Every German worker in the Ruhr was ordered to stop working. The miners put down their tools. The railroad engineers sat on their hands. The factory workers walked out. The entire region, the economic engine of a nation, ground to a complete halt. And then Kuno made the promise that sealed Germany's fate. Not a single striking worker would lose a single paycheck. The German government would pay every one of them full wages for the entire duration of the strike. Think about what that means. Millions of workers producing zero output, receiving full government salaries. And the government, already broke, already printing money to service an impossible debt, now needed to fund all of it. There was only one way. Rudolf Havenstein stepped up. His citizens were being oppressed. His duty was clear. Fund the resistance. Keep the workers paid. Run the presses until the French went home. He transformed the Reichsbank, a financial institution, into a military logistics operation with printing presses instead of rifles. The scale was staggering. The Reichsbank's own facilities couldn't keep up with the demand for new paper marks. Havenstein contracted out to private printing firms, eventually over 130 of them, alongside 30 government offices. Nearly 2,000 printing presses running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The ink barely dried before the notes were bundled up and shipped out under armed guard. Paper itself became scarce. The government bought raw stock from every available source, paying for it, of course, with the very marks it was about to print on it. The result was predictable, if you knew what you were looking at. By May 1923, the total currency in circulation had quadrupled from the start of the year. By June, it had grown 8-fold. By July, nearly 20-fold. Every new mark printed was a silent vote of no confidence against every mark already in existence. And the German people, particularly the middle class, the Mittelstand, were watching. They weren't stupid, they could see the math. They could see their savings shrinking in real time. A new kind of panic swept through German society. Not the panic to run on a bank. Something stranger, more desperate, more primal. The flight for money itself. The Germans had a name for it. Flucht in die Schwert, the flight into real assets. The moment workers received their wages, they spent them. Not because they were impulsive, because they were rational. A mark in your pocket today would buy less tomorrow and almost nothing next week. So, you converted it immediately into anything physical. A piano you didn't need. Curtains, wine, a side of beef, shoes in the wrong size, it didn't matter. Objects held value, paper did not. This created a feedback loop of devastation. The more people rushed to spend, the faster money changed hands. The faster it changed hands, the more demand pushed prices up. The higher prices rose, the more desperately people rushed to spend. The printing press and human fear were now working in tandem, each amplifying the other. Daily life became a race against the clock. Workers stopped being paid monthly, then weekly. By the height of the crisis, many were paid twice a day. At noon, factory sirens would sound. Workers would sprint to the pay windows. Their wives waited outside the factory gates. The moment cash was in hand, they ran to the baker, the butcher, the grocer, sprinting to convert paper into food before the afternoon exchange rate was telegraphed in and prices doubled again. 10 minutes could be the difference between eating and going hungry. The dollar became the only real unit of account. Shopkeepers priced their goods in US dollars and checked the wire for the latest mark-to-dollar conversion before quoting you a price. The number in marks was meaningless, it changed by the hour. The only thing that mattered was the exchange rate. The society began to crack along its seams. Doctors accepted payment in bacon. Concert pianists gave lessons for potatoes. Landlords found that their monthly rent, collected in marks, couldn't buy a single cigarette by the time it arrived. An elderly couple living on a fixed pension money they had saved their entire working lives found themselves destitute overnight. A widow living off her husband's life insurance discovered the payout was worth less than a meal. The people who had done everything right saved carefully, bought government war bonds, trusted the institutions were destroyed. The people who had borrowed heavily, owned factories, speculated in foreign currencies, they were getting rich. The farmers refused to participate. Why would they trade real food, wheat, pork, vegetables, for paper that was worthless by the time they drove home from the market? They stopped shipping to the cities. Urban populations began to face genuine starvation. Hunger riots broke out. Stores were looted not for money, but for bread. And in the middle of all this, Rudolf Havenstein held press conferences explaining that the problem was a currency shortage. He saw people scrambling desperately for marks and concluded, "We need to print more." He was a man pouring gasoline on a fire, convinced the fire needed to be more liquid. Meanwhile, in a beer hall in Munich, a failed Austrian painter with a gift for rage was watching the middle class being vaporized. He was taking notes. He had found his villains, the bankers, the socialists, The November criminals who had stabbed Germany in the back. He was building his case. The financial catastrophe was writing the political script for what came next. By August, the passive resistance in the Ruhr had collapsed. The government that staked everything on it resigned in disgrace. A new Chancellor, Gustav Stresemann, took power and made the agonizing call to stand down to effectively surrender to France. The presses did not stop, they accelerated. Here is why. The entire German tax system had ceased to function. A company would owe 1 million marks in taxes on its July profits. By the time the government's assessor sent the bill and the company paid it in September, that 1 million marks couldn't buy a postage stamp. Tax revenue collected in a currency losing half its value every 24 hours was mathematically worthless. The only way the German state could pay its soldiers, its police, its civil servants, its judges, anyone, was through the Reichsbank. Havenstein had become, in effect, the entire German treasury. October and November 1923 are the abyss. The Reichsbank began printing notes for 1 million marks, then 100 million, then 1 billion, then 1 trillion. In the final days, notes for 100 trillion marks were rushed out of the presses, ink still wet, printed on one side only, bundled into sacks and rushed under armed guard to the banks. People wallpapered their homes with 10 million mark notes because wallpaper was too expensive. Children built kites from stacks of currency. Families burned bricks of banknotes in their stoves for heat because it was cheaper than buying firewood. $1 worth 4.2 marks in 1914 was now worth 4.2 trillion marks. American tourists arrived in Berlin and dined like royalty on a few cents. They bought entire apartment buildings for a $100 bill. Starving Germans fought in gutters over the worthless mark change the tourists threw away. Havenstein, 73 years old, a relic of a vanished empire, was still at his desk, still printing, still insisting the problem was a shortage of currency. He was a captain who had sunk his own ship and was now handing out buckets, telling the drowning passengers it was their patriotic duty to bail. The ship was already on the ocean floor. Germany was not a country anymore. It was a collection of starving, furious regions on the verge of civil war. In Bavaria, a young demagogue named Adolf Hitler attempted an armed coup. The beer hall putsch in the Rhineland. Separatists with French backing tried to declare their own republic. Communist uprisings were being planned in Hamburg and Saxony. The Reichsbank was dead, the Papiermark was dead, and the republic that had printed itself into oblivion was barely breathing. Something had to change. Everything had to change. In November 1923, the Stresemann government did something audacious, something that had no right to work. They invented a new currency, but here was the problem. Germany had no gold. You cannot back a currency with gold you don't have. So the government did something that was, technically, a complete fiction, and it worked anyway. On November 15, 1923, they created the Rentenbank and issued the Rentenmark. The new currency, they announced, was backed by a compulsory mortgage on all of Germany's land and all of its industrial property. Every farm, every factory, every apartment building in the country was now nominally collateral for this new money. You couldn't actually redeem your Rentenmarks for a piece of a steel mill. It was a legal abstraction, a collective promise, a currency backed by the idea of Germany itself. It was, at its core, a lie. But it was a lie that an exhausted, traumatized nation desperately wanted to believe. The exchange rate was set. 1 Rentenmark equals 1 trillion old paper marks. 12 zeros, simply erased. But the currency alone meant nothing. The government needed a man to enforce its value. They found him in Hjalmar Schacht, brilliant, ruthless, and completely without sentiment. Schacht's first act was to do the one thing Havenstein had considered an act of treason against the German people. He turned off the presses. He told the government, "The Rentenbank will not print money to cover your debts. Not 1 mark." When ministers came begging for funds to cover salaries, Schacht said no. When powerful industrialists who had built fortunes on cheap inflationary loans came demanding credit, Schacht said no. On November 20, 1923, almost symbolically, Rudolf Havenstein died of a heart attack at his desk. He had worked himself to death running the presses to the very last moment. The old Reichsbank died with him. The result of Schacht's cold turkey policy was immediate and brutal. Businesses that existed only because of inflation collapsed overnight. Unemployment spiked. The economy, which had been floating on an infinite ocean of worthless paper, seized up like an engine suddenly run dry. But the fever broke. The German people chose to believe in the Rentenmark. A farmer who had refused to sell a single egg for 1 trillion paper marks would sell that same egg for half a Rentenmark. Shopkeepers wrote prices on tags. The prices were the same the next day. People held money instead of converting it instantly into goods. The dollar stabilized at 4.2 Rentenmarks, the exact same rate as 1914. The hyperinflation was over. But the damage was not. The German middle class had been annihilated. Their savings, decades of careful, prudent accumulation, had been reduced to ash. Their war bonds were worthless. Their pensions were gone. Their moral framework, save responsibly, trust the state, play by the rules, had been publicly and catastrophically proven to be a lie. They had been betrayed, and they never forgot. When the Great Depression arrived in 1929, the German people had no savings to weather it, no trust in Republican institutions to guide them through it, and a festering wound of resentment toward every banker, every politician, every institution that had presided over their ruin. They were looking for someone to blame, someone who promised punishment for the guilty and restoration of lost dignity. The collapse of the Reichsbank in 1923 did not just destroy a currency. It destroyed the social contract that holds a democracy together, and in doing so, it cleared the path for the monsters.